Emmett Voss read the will out loud himself, sitting at his own kitchen table 2 months before the stroke that would take him, because he wanted to watch his grandchildren's faces the moment they heard how he'd divided the 120 acres he'd spent 60 years building. "Brett gets the east cropland," Emmett said. 50 acres, good bottomland, the center pivot rig included. Whitney gets the south pasture, 50 acres, fenced and cleared. June gets the north hill. He paused, folding the paper closed. 20 acres of rock. Nobody at that table said anything unkind out loud, not with Emmett sitting right there watching, but the silence itself said enough. Brett, 17 and already talking about leasing his acres to a row crop operation the day he turned 18, glanced at his younger cousin with an expression that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite relief that it hadn't been him. Whitney, 15 and already fielding calls from a solar developer's scouting agent about the pasture's flat, sun-facing acreage, said nothing at all, which from Whitney counted as generosity. June Voss was 11 years old, small and quiet in the particular way of a child who had learned early that rooms went easier for her when she didn't fill them with noise, and she sat at that table with her hands folded in her lap and did not ask her grandfather why. She had walked that rocky north hill with him 100 times by then, trailing behind while he checked fence and talked to himself about weather. And she had never once thought of it as a punishment, only as the place that felt most like being alone with him. Everyone assumed Grandpa made a mistake. He never said a word to correct them. What none of them knew, what Emmett had never told a single soul on that farm, not his son, not his other 2 grandchildren, not even his late wife in 51 years of marriage, was what sat folded inside a cigar box in the bottom of his dresser drawer, a photograph, brittle at the corners, of a hillside vineyard planted on that same rocky north acreage in 1926, and a leather notebook in his own father's hand describing exactly why a stonemason turned grape grower had chosen the worst ground on the whole farm on purpose. Emmett's father, Aldo Voss, had come to that county in 1919 with almost nothing but a trade in stonework and a stubborn conviction, carried over from the old country his own father had left, that the poorest, rockiest ground on a piece of land was very often the best ground for a grapevine, because a vine forced to send its roots deep and wide, searching through broken stone for water. And nutrients produced smaller, more concentrated fruit than any vine coddled in rich, easy bottomland ever could. He had planted 3 acres of that north hill in vines by 1926, hauling stone by hand to build low retaining terraces the way his own father had taught him in a country where rocky hillside vineyards were not a novelty at all, but simply how serious wine had always been made. Prohibition ended that experiment before it ever fully proved itself, the vines torn out and the ground turned over to sheep pasture by a county that had no legal use anymore for a grapevine, and Aldo had died in 1941, 20 years before Emmett was old enough to have asked him the questions that mattered, leaving behind only the notebook, the photograph, and a single sentence scrawled across the notebook's final page that Emmett had read so many times across 60 years that the pencil had worn nearly to a ghost against the paper. "The rocks aren't the problem," Aldo had written. "They're the point." Aldo Voss had died the way immigrants of his generation so often did, worn thin by a country that had taken his skill and given little credit for it in return, and Emmett had grown up the youngest of 4 children in a house where his father's grief over the lost vineyard was never spoken aloud, but was somehow always present anyway, in the way his mother kept the cigar box on the mantel rather than tucked away, in the way nobody in the family ever planted so much as a single grapevine on that farm again for 6 decades. Emmett had been 7 when his father died, too young to have asked the questions he would spend the rest of his life wishing he had, and he had grown into a cautious, practical man precisely because he had watched, as a boy, what happened to a family when one man's stubborn vision outran what the world around him was ready to reward. Emmett had spent his own working life running cattle and row crops on the farm's better ground, never once finding the years, or the courage, or the certainty to try what his father had started and Prohibition had ended. He had kept the notebook anyway, quietly, the way a man keeps a debt he intends to pay someday, and when his own grandchildren finally came of an age to divide, he had looked at each of the three of them with the particular clarity old age sometimes grants a person about who they actually are, and had given the worst ground on the whole farm to the only one of them patient enough, he suspected, to ever ask why it had been worth keeping at all. He gave June the notebook the week after the will was read, sitting with her on the porch in the last of a summer evening, the cigar box open between them. "Your great-great-grandfather planted grapes on that hill," Emmett told her, "before Prohibition killed it. I never had the nerve to try it myself. I'm not asking you to either, June. I'm just telling you what's up there, underneath 30 years of pasture, if you ever wanted to look." Emmett had chosen the moment carefully, waiting until the evening light had gone soft and gold across the porch rail before he opened the cigar box, because he understood, in his last season of clear-headed health, that some inheritances needed to be handed over slowly, with the whole weight of their history explained, rather than simply discovered cold in a drawer after a funeral. "I watched 3 of my own grandchildren grow up," he told her that evening, "and I've spent a long time trying to work out which one of you actually listens instead of just waiting for their turn to talk. It isn't a contest, June. I want you to understand that. I'm not handing you the hard ground to test you. I'm handing it to you because I think you're the one who'll actually hear what it's got to say." June read the notebook cover to cover 3 times that week, in the quiet, unhurried way she did most things, and by the following spring, 12 years old, and carrying a hand-drawn plan copied from her own notes cross, referenced against her great-great-grandfather's terrace sketches, she walked the North Hill with a can of marking paint and began laying out, stone by stone, exactly where the old rows had once stood. Her grandfather died that same spring, 3 weeks after her first row markers went in. And June kept working through the funeral week the way some people keep a promise by simply not stopping, because stopping felt, to an 11-year-old grieving a grandfather who had never once made her feel small, like the one thing she couldn't afford to do. Brett leased his 50 acres of cropland to a commercial grain operation within a month of turning 18. A 5-year contract that paid him a flat rate regardless of yield, and spent the check on a truck before the first crop was even in the ground. Whitney signed with the solar developer that same year, 50 acres of pasture converting to panels within 18 months, a 25-year lease that paid steadily and asked nothing further of her at all. Both cousins, in their own way, had done exactly what a person does with land they were handed and didn't especially want to be responsible for: converted it, as fast as possible, into money that required no further attention. June did neither. She spent that first summer, 12 years old, clearing 30 years of pasture brush and volunteer cedar off 3 acres of the hill's steepest, rockiest ground, working most days after her regular chores with a neighbor's borrowed brush hog and, when the brush hog couldn't reach the steepest sections, a mattock she'd inherited along with the notebook, blistering her hands in a pattern that would have looked, to anyone who bothered to check, remarkably like the calluses her great-great-grandfather must once have carried doing the same work a century before her. June's hands, that first summer, told a story her family hadn't expected from a child who'd spent most of her 11 years quiet enough to go unnoticed at the edges of every room she entered. The mattock raised blisters across her palms within days, blisters that broke and healed and toughened into something closer to a grown laborer's calluses by August, and she took a private, unspoken pride in them, the way a person takes pride in evidence that proves a thing they've decided about themselves is true. She worked most evenings until the light failed her, cataloging in a school notebook of her own the stones she cleared from each row, sorting the largest, flattest ones into a separate pile at the row's edge, because her great-great-grandfather's sketches showed low retaining walls built from exactly that kind of stone, and she understood, hauling them by hand, one at a time, that she was doing the same physical work a stonemason's son had done a century before her, with the same 2 hands and the same stubborn patience passed down through blood she'd never met. "You're 12 years old, clearing rock by hand," her father, Russ Voss, said one evening, standing at the edge of the hill watching her work, more worried than dismissive, though the worry carried its own weight. "Your grandfather gave you the worst ground on the farm, June. I don't understand why you're treating it like it's the best." "He gave me his father's notebook too," June said, not stopping the swing of the mattock. "I think that was the point, the land and the notebook together." Russ didn't have an answer for that, and let her keep working, though the worry in his face didn't fully leave it. Not that summer, and not for a long while after, because a father watching a quiet child pour herself into something the rest of the family had already dismissed carries its own particular kind of helplessness. At the county fair that August, where the family's name still carried some weight from Emmett's decades of showing cattle, June's project became, among the small circle of relatives and neighbors who knew about it at all, a gentle, running joke, softened by grief for Emmett, but no less certain in its conclusion. Her uncle Dale Voss, Russ's older brother, and since Emmett's death, the trustee managing June's inherited acreage until she turned 18, said the plainest version of it standing at the fair's cattle barn. "She's clearing rock to plant grapes nobody in this county has grown in 100 years, Dale said to Russ, not unkindly, just certain. The way a man states a fact he considers beyond argument. "I love that girl, but somebody needs to tell her that Prohibition didn't kill that vineyard because of bad luck. It got killed because rocky hillside grapes never made sense out here to begin with. If you've ever poured yourself into work that everyone around you had already decided wasn't worth the effort, you know there's a particular quiet a child learns to carry through a summer like that, not stubbornness exactly, just the plain decision to let the vines answer the question instead of arguing about it herself." The old man who finally helped her plant those vines lived 2 farms over, a retired winemaker named Walt Pruitt, who'd spent 30 years running a small commercial vineyard in a wine region 4 states away before retiring back to the county he'd grown up in, keeping, on his own few acres, a modest home vineyard nobody in the immediate area had ever paid much attention to. June found him the way she found most things worth finding, by quietly asking around until someone mentioned his name, and she showed up at his fence line that September with her great-great-grandfather's notebook under her arm, and a question she'd been carrying all summer. "I found your grandfather's terracing sketches interesting," Walt said, after reading through the notebook twice at his own kitchen table, careful with its brittle pages in a way that told June, immediately, she'd found the right person. He knew exactly what he was doing. Dry farmed hillside vines, deep rooting, low yield per vine, but high concentration in the fruit. That's not folklore, that's textbook viticulture, just 80 years ahead of anybody local having the patience to try it. "Will you help me?" June asked. "I'll teach you," Walt said. "I won't do it for you. There's a difference, and it matters more than you understand yet." Walt had his own reasons for saying yes to a 12-year-old that no one, including June, fully understood that first afternoon. He had spent 30 commercial years building a vineyard 4 states away and had come home, in retirement, to a county that had no particular use for what he knew, no local wine industry to speak of, no younger grower curious enough to ask him a single real question about the craft in the 6 years since he'd moved back. He had begun to suspect, quietly, that everything he'd learned across 3 decades might simply die with him, unused, the way so much hard-won knowledge in farming country eventually did once the person who held it grew too old to matter to anyone still deciding what to plant. June's question at his fence line, notebook in hand, had landed on him like a debt suddenly, unexpectedly, worth paying forward. I turned down 2 other people who asked me for help over the years, Walt told her once, months into their work together. Grown men, both of them, wanting a shortcut into a hobby vineyard for their retirement. I said no because they wanted the wine without the patience. You're the first person who ever came to me already understanding you'd need both. He taught her that fall and the following spring, walking her through soil composition and root depth, and the particular grafted rootstock varieties that could handle the county's occasional hard freeze, teaching her to read a vine's leaf color for nitrogen stress and to prune for airflow instead of simply cutting back growth at random. June spent her savings, 4 years of birthday and chore money, totaling just under $1,000, on 300 bare root vines that first planting, French-American hybrid varieties Walt helped her select specifically for the hill's rocky, well-drained soil and the county's shorter growing season, planting them by hand across the cleared 3 acres in rows that followed, almost exactly. The terrace lines her great-great-grandfather had first laid out a century before. By her second spring, 13 years old now, she had planted 600 more vines across the remainder of the acreage Walt judged suitable, financed partly by more birthday money and partly by a small allowance Walt insisted on paying her for helping in his own vineyard on weekends. Work that taught her as much about the craft's patient rhythms as anything in her great-great-grandfather's notebook ever had. The setback came from a direction June had never once thought to guard against, because it did not come from weather or from the vines themselves at all. Her Uncle Dale, still managing the trust that held her inherited acreage until her 18th birthday, received an offer that sprang from a gravel and aggregate company scouting the county's rocky hillsides for quarry potential, a lease offer worth $40,000 a year for the mineral rights beneath June's 20 acres, money that dwarfed anything a slow, unproven vineyard project could plausibly promise for years, if ever. Dale, who had watched Brett and Whitney's leases pay out steadily with no further effort required of either cousin, brought the offer to Russ that summer with genuine conviction that he was doing right by a niece too young to see the whole picture clearly. "I have fiduciary responsibility for that trust until she's 18, Dale told Russ. Sitting at the kitchen table with the offer papers spread between them, June listening from the hallway where neither man realized she could hear. $40,000 a year, Russ guaranteed, against 3 acres of grapevines that might never produce a bottle worth selling. I'd be failing that girl if I didn't at least put the offer in front of you. It's her land, Russ said. Grandpa left it to her specifically. Grandpa's not the trustee, Dale said. I am, until she's 18, and the terms let me approve a mineral lease without her consent if I judge it in her financial interest. I'm not saying I want to do this. I'm saying I might have to. June did not sleep that night, lying awake in her room with her great-great-grandfather's notebook open on the blanket beside her, reading his final sentence over and over by flashlight. The rocks aren't the problem, they're the point. That night, for the first time since she'd started clearing brush at 12 years old, the sentence felt less like guidance and more like a cruel joke, because the rocks were, apparently, exactly the problem after all. Worth more broken up and hauled away than they had ever been worth left standing as terraces for vines that might take another 5 years to prove themselves, if they ever proved themselves at all. She thought about her grandfather, about the cigar box, about 100 quiet walks across that hill trailing behind him while he talked to himself about weather, and wondered whether he had made a mistake after all, handing a 12-year-old the one piece of ground legally vulnerable enough that a grown man with good intentions and a fiduciary spreadsheet could still take it away from her before she ever got the chance to finish what she'd started. She did not go to her father or her uncle the next morning. She went to Walt Pruitt's kitchen table instead, notebook in hand, and told him everything. Walt listened the whole way through without interrupting, the particular patient quiet of a man who had spent 30 years learning that vines and people both needed room to finish a thought before you offered one back. "Your uncle's not wrong that the money's real," he said finally. "He's wrong about what he's actually weighing it against. Nobody's put a real number on what those vines are worth yet, because nothing's fruited. That's not the same as nothing being there. Let's give him a number instead of an argument." Walt drove out to the hill himself that week, walking June's 2 seasons of plantings row by row, testing soil samples, counting bud break and cane growth against what he knew from 30 commercial years. A healthy young vineyard on rocky, well-drained hillside ground ought to be showing at that stage. He wrote up his findings formally, on his own vineyard's letterhead, a professional assessment rather than a grandfatherly opinion, projecting conservatively. What 900 vines of that variety and that soil type could reasonably be expected to yield within 3 more seasons, and what fruit of that concentration typically commanded per ton from regional wineries hungry for exactly the kind of low-yield, high-intensity grapes hillside vines like these were known to produce. The projected number, cautious and clearly labeled as an estimate rather than a promise, still ran higher over a 10-year horizon than the gravel company's flat lease, though Walt was careful to tell June, sitting at his kitchen table reviewing the figures with her, that the real argument wasn't the 10-year number at all. "A gravel lease ends the land," Walt said. "Once they quarry it, there's no vineyard, no pasture, nothing but a hole in the ground that outlives every one of us. A vineyard's the opposite kind of asset entirely. It gets more valuable the older the vines get, not less, for decades past your own lifetime, if it's tended right. Your uncle's comparing a number to a number. He's not comparing what kind of land either choice leaves behind. What would you have done, 13 years old, watching 2 grown men decide the fate of the one thing you'd poured 2 years of your life into?" June did not fight her uncle directly. She asked Walt to come to the meeting with her instead, and she asked her grandmother's old friend, a retired county extension agent named Marge Costello, to attend as well. And she walked into that kitchen table conversation with Walt's written assessment in hand instead of a child's plea, because she had learned in 2 seasons of hard, quiet labor that the vines themselves argued more persuasively than she ever could on her own. Dale read Walt's assessment twice, the same careful, unhurried way he read any contract, and looked up at his niece across the table with an expression that had shifted, somewhere in the reading, from the certainty he'd carried into the room. "You're 13, Dale said. "I wasn't trying to hurt you, June. I was trying to protect you from a bet you're too young to fully understand you're making." "I understand it," June said. "I've understood it for 2 years. I just never had anybody willing to write it down in a way you'd actually read." Dale sat with that a long moment, turning the assessment over in his hands, and Marge Costello, who had said nothing through the whole exchange until then, finally spoke. "Dale, I've reviewed hundreds of these agricultural lease decisions in 22 years with the Extension Office," she said. "I've never once seen a mineral lease that didn't foreclose every other option on that ground permanently. Your niece is asking for time, not money. That's a smaller ask than it looks like on a spreadsheet." Dale declined the gravel lease that week, formally in writing, and told Russ afterward, quietly, that he intended to let June's project run its course without further interference, though he admitted, standing at the kitchen door on his way out, that he still wasn't fully convinced the vines would prove out. "I'm not asking you to be convinced yet," June told him. "Just to wait and see." The next 3 seasons passed in the same slow, deliberate rhythm the first 2 had. June, now 15, and doing most of the vineyard's canopy management and pruning herself under Walt's steadily lighter supervision, learning to read a vine's stress signals the way her great-great-grandfather must have learned them a century before, by watching closely rather than by following a schedule. The first real crop came in her 3rd full season, small by any commercial standard, 4 tons across the whole 900 vines, but concentrated exactly the way Walt's textbook principles and Aldo's century-old instincts had both predicted, small, thick-skinned clusters that carried, even to June's untrained palate, a depth of flavor nothing grown on the farm's richer bottomland ever had. Walt arranged, that fall, for a small regional winery 2 counties over to sample the fruit, a decision he made carefully, choosing a winemaker he'd known for 15 years and trusted to give an honest, uncoached assessment rather than a favor extended for an old friend's sake. The winemaker, a sharp-eyed woman named Priya Anand's cousin, coincidentally working the same regional circuit Denise Aldridge's office, often referenced in its own agricultural case studies, drove out to walk the rows herself before agreeing to taste anything at all. Dry-farmed hillside fruit at this concentration is hard to find in this whole region, the winemaker told June and Walt, standing among the vines with a cluster in hand, turning it over the way a jeweler turns a stone toward the light. Most growers around here are still farming for volume on flat, easy ground. This is a different philosophy entirely. Whoever taught you this understood something most people in this business take a full career to learn, if they ever learn it at all. "My great-great-grandfather," June said. "I just finished what he started." The winery signed a purchase contract that same week, modest in its first year but structured to grow with the vineyard's yield over the following seasons, the first real income June's 20 acres of rocky North Hill had produced in nearly a century, and word of it moved through the county the way real numbers eventually move through any farming community. Slower than gossip, but far more durable once the figures themselves started doing the talking. Dale drove out to the hill himself that October, walking the rows with June the way he'd once walked them doubting her, and stood a long while at the edge of the newest planting before he said anything at all. "I owe you an apology I've been putting off for 2 years, Dale said. "I was managing a spreadsheet instead of trusting the person the spreadsheet actually belonged to. Your grandfather saw something in you at 11 years old that took me until you were 16 to finally understand." "You don't owe me an apology," June said. "You were trying to protect me. I understand that better now than I did the night I heard you and Dad at the kitchen table. I still owe it," Dale said, "and I'm giving it anyway, whether you think you need it or not." Brett's grain lease came up for renewal that same year, the flat-rate contract having paid him steadily for 5 seasons while asking nothing further of his attention, and Whitney's solar panels kept generating their quiet, reliable payments without a single afternoon of her own labor required. Neither cousin regretted the choice, exactly, but both had, by then, watched enough of June's slow work unfold to understand that they had traded a kind of ownership for a kind of income, while June, working the hardest ground on the whole farm by far, had built something that would still be growing, and still be hers in a way no lease ever quite made land belong to a person, long after both their contracts expired. June was 17 the spring the vineyard produced its first crop, large enough to require hired seasonal help at harvest. Walt Pruitt among the pickers, despite being well past the age most men retired from that kind of physical work. And it was Walt, resting at the row's end with a bucket of fruit beside him, who said the thing that finally closed the circle her grandfather had opened 6 years before. "Your great-great-grandfather would recognize these rows," Walt said. "Not just the vines, the patience it took to grow them right. That's rarer than the grapes, if you want the truth of it. June kept the cigar box on a shelf in the small equipment shed she'd built at the vineyard's edge. Her great-great-grandfather's photograph and notebook protected now in an archival sleeve Walt had helped her order, available for whichever of her own children someday inherited that hill and needed to understand exactly what they were holding. She had started, that same spring, teaching a neighbor boy the pruning techniques Walt had taught her, patient in the exact way Walt had once been patient with her, because she had learned, across 6 seasons of slow work on ground everyone else had written off, that knowledge kept quietly in a drawer helped nobody. And knowledge passed on, generation, folding into generation, was the only kind of inheritance that actually compounded. The rocks aren't the problem, she thought that spring, standing at the edge of 900 vines heavy with fruit on ground that had grown nothing but sheep pasture for 80 years before she'd picked up a mattock at 12 years old. They're the point. The thought carried none of the fear it had carried the night she lay awake with a flashlight, certain her uncle's spreadsheet was about to end everything before it had the chance to prove itself. It felt, finally, like the plain truth her great-great-grandfather had died a century too early to see fully vindicated, and her grandfather had died 3 seasons too early to see fruited, though she understood now, walking those rows, that he had never actually needed to see it. He had only needed to trust that she would. That's the whole of it, and maybe the only lesson worth keeping from it. Everyone assumed Grandpa made a mistake, dividing that 120 acres the way he did, and he never once said a word to correct them, because the correction was never his to make. It belonged to a quiet child with a mattock and a century-old notebook, and to the 6 patient seasons it took her to prove that the kind of love that hands you the hardest ground and trusts you to find out why is very often the kind that lasts the longest of all. If you've ever been handed the thing nobody else wanted and found out later it was the truest gift in the room, tell us where you're listening from and about the person patient enough to see it in you first. If this story found you today, share it with somebody still tending the rocky ground everyone else gave up on too soon. Whatever hard, unglamorous inheritance you're standing on tonight, may it prove itself in its own good season. And may the people who doubted you come around with open hands instead of empty ones.